By the mid-1990s, autofocusing technology in cameras was a very regular and normal thing. It was in full swing. Competitive brands like Canon, Nikon, Minolta were integrating this technology into all their new lenses and camera systems.
Never see life the same way again. Maxim, the world's first SLR with built-in autofocus.
Now, autofocus works by adjusting a tiny electronic motor to move the glass elements inside a lens to adjust the plane of focus. Now, it's simple in concept, but it completely changes how lenses are designed and engineered. And this poses a problem for a brand like Contax. How do you move forward with autofocus technology that everyone else is adapting without abandoning your beautiful Zeiss lens system? So introducing the Contax AX, probably the most over-engineered 35mm film camera I've ever used. So the Contax AX was released in the spring of 1996. This is the only 35mm film camera that can autofocus manual focus lenses to date. So there's no other camera that can achieve this. And it does this by moving the entire mirror box assembly within the camera instead of relying on motors inside lenses. So you can see that this thing is massive, and it needs to be massive in order to move the assembly back and forth. And the result is that this camera body is probably the same weight and size as a Mamiya 7, while still being a 35mm film camera. So it's absolutely ridiculous to look and hold. For some added context, Contax had already been an established player in the SLR game since the 1970s. They had already developed the Contax RTS, the Contax 137MD, this camera, which is the Contax 159, and they were beautiful and sleek products. So Contax Zeiss had collaborated with Japanese company Yashica, which was later acquired by Kyocera. And they actually had the design done by Porsche, which is really random, but the result is you get like a really sleek, nice looking SLR. You can see the size difference over here is that the Contax AX looks ridiculous next to the Contax 159. So there's a lot to cover about this camera, and so you can skip this section if you don't want to know button by button detail about the functions on this camera, but I think it's important to really understand why it's so over-engineered. So we can start on the top plate, and we can start on the left-hand side. So this Contax AX can shoot anywhere from 4 seconds to 4 thousandths of a second, and it has a ton of different shooting modes. So it has AV, which is aperture priority, TV, which is shutter priority, P, which is auto, M for manual, X for flash, B for bulb. Now, if you shoot in aperture or auto mode, you can actually achieve a higher shutter speed of 1/6000th of a second. Now, if you adjust the lever down to the ISO value, you can adjust your ISO manually from anywhere from ISO 5 to ISO 6400. Now, there of course is DX code readers in here, so you don't need to do that if you don't want to, but if you have bulk loaded film or non-DX coded film, you can adjust that manually. Now there's another little area called CF, which you can change the lever to, and this is custom function. I'm going to talk about that a little later, and you'll see why. Now on the right-hand side of the camera top plate, you have your on-off lever, and then you'll see AEL, which is auto exposure lock if you want to lock your exposure. To the left of that, you have your exposure compensation dial. You can go minus, +2. And then you have another little lever on that dial, which is called ABC, Auto Bracketing Control. If you're familiar with a lot of pro cameras nowadays, they have this exposure bracketing control. So this means it'll take 3 photos with 3 different exposures. Usually it's your regular exposure that you pick, and then you can adjust whether you want half stop plus, half stop minus, and then a full stop above it and full stop below. I don't really use this that often, but it's pretty useful when you're shooting landscapes, so you can get a variety of exposures just in case you aren't sure what you want, or you can mix your foreground with your background. This is there if you need it. I leave it usually at 0. Now to the bottom right, you have your shutter drive speed, and then you have your autofocus lever. So the autofocus lever has, from the bottom up, CAF, which is continuous autofocus. Then you have SAF, which is single autofocus, MF for manual focus, and then you actually have a macro capability in this camera. I'm telling you, this camera has absolutely everything. So with macro, you can only manual focus, but because the internal mirror box moves back and forth to achieve autofocus, you can use this capability in macro mode for it to act as an extension tube. Now, usually extension tubes you mount to the lens mount of the camera body, and then it adds a little bit of length so that you can focus a little closer, but that is all done internally in this camera. So I think that's a really neat feature. If you're really into close-up macro photography, you have that option. Now on the drive speed dial, which you have to pull up and turn in order to change the function, from the left to right, you have your multiple exposures, then you have your single shot, and then CL, which is continuous low. So this camera can actually shoot a burst of photos. CL is 3 frames per second, CH is 5 frames per second, and then to the right of that, you have your 2-second self-timer, 10-second self-timer. So again, you can do regular, photography, and you can also do fast sports and action with 5 frames per second. I mean, this camera is not an Nikon F5. It can't shoot 8 frames per second, but I think 5 frames per second for the average film photographer is more than enough. So to the left of the shutter drive dial is our screen. Of course, this will display things like a frame counter. But like I had mentioned before, for the CF custom function, this is where you can change a lot of different options within the camera. And you can customize a lot of things, but they don't do it in the most intuitive way. So if you change the left-hand dial to CF, meaning custom function, you'll see that the screen displays 2 numbers with a dash in between. And the numbers on the left range from 1 to 8, and the number on the right ranges from 0 to 1. This is basically how they go through all their little options, like leaving the film rewind to be manual instead of automatic, adjusting things like the AF assist lamp on this camera, whether to turn it off and on. All of that is done through the custom function button, meaning the number on the left is the option you want to change, and the number on the right is whether it's on or off or whatever you're changing it to. I could run through them all now, but I think it's just going to be too long. It's going to take up too much of the video. So I'm going to leave a table below, or an image right now you can pause on to look. I also have a written review on my blog, so if you want to look at that for just to save that image, it's on there. Now, if you look at the rear of the camera, you'll see on the top left corner, that's the button that you hold in order to adjust your exposure mode lever. And then in the middle, you have your beautiful viewfinder. I think this is one of the most clear and really easily viewable SLR viewfinders I've ever used. It has a built-in diopter too, which is amazing. And there's a built-in viewfinder blind. So if you're doing long exposures and say you don't want potential light leaks coming from your viewfinder, you can actually close that. And then to the right, you have your rewind lever for your film once you're done with your roll. In order to rewind this manually, you need to press the button first and then hit the lever and it'll rewind your film. I actually prefer to do this manually versus letting the camera do it itself, because once I'm done with the roll, I don't want to, be in a quiet environment and then you just hear the whirring of 36 frames going back into a cassette. I think that's kind of annoying. And then to the right, you have the beautiful autofocus button. So the autofocus is not done through the shutter button. The shutter purely just for the photo. And I prefer to have a back button autofocus, just like where it's positioned now. And then on the outer rim, it's actually a dial to switch between autofocus and autofocus lock. So if you don't want the focus to adjust for some reason, you can change the dial to AFL. I rarely use this, but the option's there. So to talk about the bottom plate of this camera, you just twist and turn a knob, and then the bottom plate comes right off. I would be really careful about this, even though the rest of the camera is pretty well built and very sturdy, obviously. This part is really flimsy, and you don't want to lose this because then your battery's just exposed and it'll probably fall out. And if you can find a good condition Contax AX, it actually has the table of custom function indicators. Really easy to see, because obviously you're not going to remember, I think for the most part, like all of these combinations if you need to adjust a setting. So it's nice to have. But otherwise, don't lose this thing. All right, this might sound confusing, but the battery on this camera is a 2CR5 battery. So it's basically 2 little batteries combined together, and you can find them online. I don't know if they sell them in grocery stores. And then let's talk about the front of the camera. You have this giant glass autofocus assist lamp right next to the shutter button. This emits like a bright red light. You've probably seen this on modern cameras. If it's in like a dark environment and it needs some light, it'll shoot a red light so that it'll help get some autofocus. I turned that off because I think it's just too bright. And like if you're in a dark restaurant or something, everyone can just see you, with this red light poking out. On the other side of the camera, however, is a lever for your exposure metering. This I would recommend checking every time you use this camera because it can get easily switched. So this camera can only shoot center weighted average or spot metering. Right now I have it on spot metering because this camera only has one autofocus point. So I'm typically focusing on, on the center of my image. And so I just changed it to expose for the center of my image. So in order to enable the autofocus capability on this camera, all you need to do is set your lens to infinity focus, and then you turn on the camera and you can focus and start right away. Now, with that said, the autofocus on this is not fast at all. I don't actually think it's particularly slow either, but compared to the cameras that were released around the time, like the Nikon F5 was also released in 1996, faster autofocusing system. It also had 5 autofocus points. This only has 1. And all isn't lost if you can't get autofocus right away with this camera, because if you try to autofocus, you can get probably close as possible, and then you can manually adjust the focus ring on your lens to get focus. So you have to be somewhat patient when you're using this camera. Now, one of the biggest reasons to invest in the Contax AX is the wide variety of lenses you're able to adapt into this camera and have the ability to autofocus all these manual focus lenses. So I'll start off with the proprietary Contax Yashica mount. So that's the mount that this camera and lens were all designed for, and that's right here. So with me, I have the Contax Zeiss lenses. These are beautiful lenses. These are the famed 50mm f1.4 planars. These are typically adapted by a lot of modern photographers because they're unique character. And a lot of videographers and filmmakers love using these because they're kind of like the cheaper cousins to the Carl Zeiss Super Speeds. Now, those are really famous cinema lenses used in films like The Shining, The Terminator, Lost in Translation. So really great lenses with a ton of different character. And you're probably also wondering, why do I have 2 50mm f1.4 planars? Well, one is an AE, which stands for auto exposure, and one is MM for multi-mode. So auto exposure is just a fancy name for the original Zeiss lenses. They just dubbed this and gave it a name because the MMs have a special feature. They have a little mechanical linkage to the camera itself. So if you have a MM lens, you can activate shutter priority or full auto mode. So the camera can adjust the aperture here. It cannot do that in the AE lenses. So the way to tell these AE and MM lenses apart is that on the smallest aperture, f16, there's a green lettering here. And if you look at the Contax AX, when you go to shutter priority mode or auto mode, it also has the same coloring. So it's a way to indicate, hey, this lens is capable for these modes, because if you have an AE lens, you cannot use shutter priority or auto mode on the Contax AX. So be aware when you're buying lenses. And usually if you're on eBay, you'll see Carl Zeiss planar 50mm f1.4 AEG. The third letter just means Germany or Japan. I don't think there's much of a difference where it's manufactured. I think purists typically like, oh, it's Zeiss in Germany, so that must mean it's better. Not really. I think the QA is still the same whether it's Germany or Japan. And one last thing is that with the AE lenses, they're considered cheaper, not because they're really bad in any sort of way, but they have an interesting bokeh. So when you close down the aperture, you'll notice the aperture blades don't form this perfect circle. And so people call this ninja star bokeh, because what happens is that when you start stopping down, your out of focus elements, your lights, will form what looks like a ninja star. So if you think that looks distracting, then you probably want to get a multi-mode lens, or if you want to use the shutter priority or auto modes. And then there are also cheaper alternatives because these lenses go for a couple $100. The 50mm planar 1.7, still Zeiss glass, a little bit more plastic in the construction, and it's rumored to actually be sharper at f1.7 than the planars at 1.4 or 1.8. And they have a really quirky lens here, which is the 45 f2.8. This is a tiny pancake lens, but probably one of the best pancake lenses I've ever used. It's incredibly tiny, and you throw it onto this Contax AX, it looks kind of ridiculous for how tiny it is. And then here I have a large push-pull telephoto zooms. This is one of the popular Vario Sonar 100 to 300 with variable aperture. So that was just the Zeiss glass. And I'll leave a link in the description where you can see a whole database of different Zeiss glass you can buy. There's more down there like the 3570 that are super famous that people really, really like using. But I also want to talk about Yashica's side of the lens system because it is called Contax Yashica. So Yashica produced their own side of lenses. They produced the Yashica DSB and Yashica ML. DSB is like their super trash, cheap lenses. If you go on eBay, you'll find them really, really cheap, maybe for a couple dollars. Do not pick those up. Those are terrible lenses. If you want to get cheaper lenses for this system that aren't Zeiss lens, get the Yashica ML lens. Remember, Yashica ML. So that's like their premium version of their own lenses. And the rumor is because they're developed in the same factory in Japan, like the AEJ lenses, you'll get similar performance. Obviously not the same because the Yashica ML lenses probably don't have the same coating or QA that the Zeiss lenses got. So you'll see this ML, like the binding for the texture on the focus ring is kind of coming off, so I had to glue it. Definitely cheaper, but for the resulting image, I think it's pretty damn good. So that's the Yashica side of the Contax Yashica system. The beauty of the Contax AX kicks in here is that not only can you use the proprietary lenses of the system, which there are a ton of good lenses, you can adapt M42 screw mount lenses. So that's a ton of different lenses. If you use M42 lenses, adapt them to your mirrorless camera or use M42 cameras, you'll know that there's just a million lenses you can choose from. Like for example, the Helios lenses. This right here is a Helios 44M, not the 44-2, which I have in the other room. You can adapt this by simply adding a Contax Yashica M42 little metal adapter on the back. These aren't like super secure, but they're pretty cheap and you can add them to any M42 screw mount lens. So I adapted them to this legendary Carl Zeiss Jena Biotar 58mm f2. This is what the Helios 44-2 is actually modeled after. And so this tiny little lens, I can just add a little adapter and throw it onto the Contax AX. One of my favorite lenses to use is also the Carl Zeiss Jena MC Flextagon 35mm f2.4. I saw a video from another YouTuber slash filmmaker, and he was talking about how great this lens was to use adapted for video use. And so I wanted to pick this up, and I got a really good deal on a clean version of this lens, and I adapted it to my Contax AX. This is one of my favorite lenses to use with this camera. But yeah, that is the crazy lens lineup that you can use for the Contax AX. So your favorite Helios lens or whatnot, M42, you can autofocus them with the Contax AX. So another downside that I need to mention about the Contax SLR system, like not even just the Contax AX, like even this Contax 159, is that they heavily rely on their electronics. So if something happens with the wiring inside the camera, then you basically lose all function. I actually had a small problem with this Contax AX. Luckily, it wasn't the electronics, but it was something with the lens mount. It wasn't reading the aperture value properly within the camera. I had to take it to the only certified Contax repair center in the US, and that was luckily in New York at Nippon Photo Clinic. And because they were like the only people left with that knowledge to fix these kind of cameras, it was really expensive even just to fix the little lens mount. So if you do invest in a Contax AX or an SLR, if they do break, it might cost an arm and a leg. Like I think it's cheaper to actually buy a new Contax camera than to repair it. But I wanted to preserve this camera body instead of just throwing it in the trash. So I had this fixed. So long video, but to conclude, I think the Contax AX is obviously just more of a novelty camera more than anything, even though it is completely usable. I think the perk of this camera really comes from If you have a large collection of contact size lenses or Yashica lenses or M42 screw mount lenses, you can use all those lenses on this camera. I think that's a beautiful thing. So if you're a videographer or photographer already using those lenses and you want one of the most over-engineered pieces of tech from the 90s, I would say pick up the Contax AX.